Okay, so I just want to start with a land acknowledgement before I get into my own paper. I'll begin by acknowledging that any conversation about land must fundamentally recognize the presence of Indigenous people in both the spaces represented by my work and in the space in which this research was conducted. Framing my work through the context of a land acknowledgement is part of my commitment to scholarship that challenges the totalizing tendencies of settler colonial narratives and reveals them to be contingent and constructed. So the American landscape can be read as a landscape of violence that has been politically sanctioned, racially motivated, protracted, and enduring. Federal land laws and property entitlements have and continue today to shape and reinforce the erosion of Indigenous peoples' rights as both members of their own sovereign nations and as citizens of the United States. Tracking how legal documents parcel, allocate, sell, and regulate land in the United States demonstrates the ways that legal frameworks have been bold political instruments to enact social and physical violence upon Indigenous populations. So starting with Lefebvre's assertion that violence directed towards space is required for the endurance of state power, I'd like to suggest that in the context of the American landscape, this violence is directed towards Indigenous populations. And perhaps more to the point that this violence has been measured, it's been mapped, it's been legislated, commodified, and maybe above all authorized by the governance over land. So the American landscape can then be seen as an in situ archive, documenting the material manipulations and symbolic constructions of land as a registration of society's values and attitudes towards Indigenous peoples. From the very inception of the United States, property and land entitlement was seen as a way to move away from the tyranny and oppression associated with the British Empire's colonial conquest. And what perhaps is the most important aspect of these two quotes is that they provide very clear clues for how conceptions of property, democracy, and citizenry were developed from the very beginning of the state. John Adams here claims that only through a balance of property can there be a balance of power. And David Ramsey takes this idea one step further, claiming that westward expansion would upend savagery and accommodate a growing American citizenry. So even before the Revolutionary War was complete and the United States existed as a sovereign nation, there is a strong sense from people in political power that the creation of a new nation goes hand in hand with the creation of a system of property, and that such a system was open only to white, Christian, Euro-American settlers. So it's within this political context that property, progress, and prosperity are all intertwined, and from which prevailing beliefs that it was both the destiny and the duty of Americans to expand, own, and occupy this land forms. This iconic image shows America's ambitions for its westward expansion. Symbolically, the ethereal woman in white brings light to the darkness of the Wild West, while also laying the foundation for modernization and infrastructure. It's also notable that in the bottom right corner is an illustration already depicting a fence and a hedgerow being used to define private property. But what makes the relationship between land and indigeneity so complicated is that their status in the eyes of the federal government was highly variable depending on the interests of the government. So in the first 100 years of its establishment as a nation, the United States engaged in 367 government-to-government treaties, establishing that the United States believed that these indigenous groups were in fact sovereign, autonomous nations. And yet, when it was self-serving, the federal government also maintained its entitlement to exercise political power over indigenous groups. So these discrepancies produced particularly strategic conditions for the US in the context of land. When diplomacy, nation-to-nation negotiation did not result in the desired acquisition of land, the US could justify violence, theft, and coercion by denying indigenous sovereignty. One of the first policies implemented by the newly formed nation was the Land Ordinance Act of 1785, which grew out of a pervasive cultural belief and political agenda that explicitly linked private property to a new American national identity. This national policy translated into the surveying and dividing land into distributable and highly regularized parcels attendant to a democratic distribution of power as Adams had envisioned. The distribution of private property thus became an essential component to early goals of the new nation and its citizens, regardless of who had previously or were currently occupying those same lands. In this context, landowners had the legal right to reap special social, economic, and political benefits of ownership, while those without private property were altogether excluded. This included, of course, indigenous populations who were omitted from participating in this system for a number of reasons, partly because of their own different worldview about the ability to own land and resource, but also because of fundamentally racist land and citizenship policies which legally prohibited them from participating. So in a series of coordinated federal policies in the early and mid-19th century, indigenous groups were systematically, involuntarily, and often violently removed from their ancestral homelands. The first such policy, the Indian Removal Act, authorized the federal government to dispossess the lands held by indigenous nations, which fell within existing state borders, and to relocate them to undeveloped lands west of the Mississippi River. President Jackson's words in this context provide two insights. First, he makes a clear distinction between the citizens of the United States and the indigenous population. And second, he advocates for a definitive spatial separation between these two populations. His choice to use the words force and disappear when he says they must necessarily yield to the force of circumstances and ere long disappear was not merely rhetorical, but instead speaks directly to his political agenda and to the violence that was used and justified in the enforcing of these policies. So it's under these circumstances that less than 20 years later, the federal government passes yet another law, allocating funds to remove indigenous nations again, this time onto federally demarcated and federally monitored reservation lands. According to the government, these lands were set aside for the protection of indigenous groups from a growing encroachment of white settlers moving westward. Many of the indigenous tribes forced to relocate were those who had already been forcibly removed once before as a result of the Indian Removal Act. The second phase of this policy stipulated that no longer would any indigenous group be recognized as independent or sovereign, but would instead be viewed as wards under the jurisdiction of the federal government. So examined together, the Indian Removal Act and the Indian Appropriations Acts are a coordinated set of federally sanctioned violence inflicted upon indigenous nations through the dispossession of land and the denial of sovereign status. Indigenous people here are not members of the United Citizenry, but through these policies, they are also stripped of citizenship to their own tribal nations. The efforts of removal, coupled with increased development pressure and westward migrations of white settlers, resulted in a series of bloody, violent conflicts between indigenous groups and white settlers who were often backed by federally appointed and funded militia. And it was during these wars that internment camps were set up all across the United States to house captured indigenous people who were imprisoned without due process or trial, a right that was reserved for only citizens. This drawing was made by a captured Cheyenne leader during his internment, depicting changing development patterns on his land. So you see evidence of urbanization, agriculture, railroad. In a larger and more deliberate effort, members of the Navajo Nation, who occupied land in northern Arizona, were forced into internment camps in present-day New Mexico. The forced marches were between 300 and 400 miles long, and they took nearly 3 weeks of continuous walking to complete. Over 50 separate trips were made in extreme weather conditions over the course of the 2-year internment period. It's estimated that between 8,500 and 10,000 Navajo people were forced into camps, and approximately a quarter of those died of starvation, exhaustion, and diseases that went untreated. Meanwhile, white settlers stole, settled, and cultivated their lands that they left behind. In 1868, the Navajo Nation signed a treaty with the U.S. federal government ending internment. As part of the negotiation, they were allowed to return to a very small portion of their reservation lands prior to imprisonment. But this area was already a much smaller area mass in relation to their original homelands. So up until this moment, the federal government had used policy to expand their land holdings, establish a formal system of private property, and encourage development. And in this context, the indigenous nations had been treated as an other, separated physically and culturally from mainstream American society through the implementation of the federal reservation system. And in the late 19th century, there was a marked shift in how the government ceded the indigenous nations. So with the passing of the General Allotment Act in 1887, the federal government's policy actively shifted toward breaking up the tribal mass, integrating reservation lands into the American economy, and assimilating indigenous people into American society as independent individuals, not as members of other organizations or nations. The General Allotment Act divided reservation lands into private parcels that were then sold to individuals. The goal was to replace traditional modes of collective use and occupancy with a system of individualized ownership that would contribute meaningfully to the American economy, an effort that President Teddy Roosevelt called a pulverizing engine to break up the tribal mass. In exchange for renouncing their identity and entitlement to reservation lands, those who accepted private allotments were granted U.S. citizenship, underlining once more the strong and longstanding association between citizenship and private property in the United States. As part of this assimilation process, the General Allotment Act also attempted to open reservation lands for white settlement and to encourage ranching, timber, and mining interests on these lands. The Department of Interior produced images like this to encourage such development. In the end, the General Allotment Act proved quite successful, and President Teddy Roosevelt was absolutely right. In fewer than 20 years, indigenous communities lost almost half of their land. Further, almost half of the lands that they did retain were either arid or semi-arid lands, and not particularly productive for traditional subsistence farming and fishing, which were longstanding practices in many indigenous nations. But by the 1920s, it had become apparent that much of those lands apportioned under the General Allotment Act were immensely rich in mineral deposits and natural resources. And so gaining access to those minerals became part of a federal economic development policy. Citizenship here was leveraged. So in 1924, under the Indian Citizenship Act, all indigenous people were granted citizenship to the United States, whether they desired it or not. So with all members of indigenous groups now incorporated into the American citizenry and not as representatives of other nations, resource and land negotiations could be conducted with different and often much more lenient requirements. Over the course of the next 3 decades, Congress continued to disenfranchise and dispossess the indigenous population of their rights, both as citizens of their own tribal nations and as citizens of the United States. So under the Indian Reorganization Act, all tribal decisions were subject to the approval of the Secretary of the Interior, a federal agency, that further eroded the authority of tribal nations to affirm their own cultural practices, sacred histories, citizenship requirements, judicial systems, and governmental bodies. Throughout the 1950s, federal termination policies both continued to encourage indigenous assimilation through citizenship and undermine indigenous rights to sovereignty and protection of homelands by disassembling and destabilizing their status as nations. Through this policy, 109 indigenous nations were dissolved, and their reservation lands were given over to federal or state jurisdiction. Further, federal funding to reservations dramatically shrunk or was altogether eliminated, the result of which directly limited access to health, education, and economic services, and forced thousands of indigenous people to migrate to urban centers. Although these termination policies were eventually overturned and many of the reservations were reinstated, today there are still more than 500 tribes and nations who seek federal recognition. Without federal recognition, an indigenous nation cannot make any claims to sovereignty, nor any claims to ancestral lands. Meeting the requirements for federal recognition has been severely narrowed by the history of federal policies that I've described before. So although under many circumstances, American citizenship is a means through which one is protected from violence, in the case of the indigenous nations of the United States, citizenship has been the very mechanism to inflict that violence. Lack of federal acknowledgement of the sovereign status of indigenous nations is a demonstration that land, law, and property today are still central to ongoing violence enacted, despite their status as American citizens. Thanks.